Rajasthan, December 2025. In multiple villages, a caste council announces that women should not use smartphones with internet access. The justification is protection. The decision triggers protests. Within days, it's withdrawn after administrative intervention. Let's shift to Sydney. In Australia, legislation has been passed restricting social media access to those under 16. Platforms are required to enforce age limits with significant penalties for non-compliance. Let's come down to New Delhi. At a global AI policy summit, child safety in digital environments becomes a recurring theme. Policymakers raise concerns about algorithmic amplification, addictive design, and youth vulnerability. Across countries, the language is similar: protection, safety, duty of care. Governments are no longer debating whether social media influences young people. They are debating whether access itself should be restricted. And that brings us to the central question of today's episode. Should social media access for children be banned or restricted as a matter of policy? This is not an isolated development. Across democracies, concerns about children and digital environments have moved beyond public debate into legislation. In Australia, lawmakers have passed legislation restricting social media access for those under 16, requiring platforms to enforce age limits and imposing significant penalties for non-compliance. France is advancing stricter age verification rules and reinforcing parental consent requirements. In the UK, the Online Safety Act places stronger duties on platforms to reduce harmful content exposure for children. What was once treated primarily as a matter of parental supervision is increasingly being framed as a regulatory responsibility of the state. This shift reflects a deeper concern about how these platforms operate. Policymakers increasingly argue that social media platforms should not be viewed simply as communication tools. They are designed systems built to capture and sustain attention. The algorithms prioritize the content most likely to keep users engaged because engagement drives advertising revenue. And practice, content that provokes strong emotional reactions, outrage, anxiety, excitement, tends to travel further through these systems. When digital environments operate in this way, the consequences are not the same for everyone. For adults, this raises questions about autonomy and informed choice. For children, whose cognitive and emotional capacities are still developing, it raises a deeper concern: developmental vulnerability. This is why the debate has moved beyond a cultural concern in a single country. It has become a broader question about how democratic societies should govern digital life. And that leads to the most important question in this debate: what does the evidence actually show? Before governments restrict access, they must answer a prior question: what does the evidence actually show? In recent years, the argument that social media is harming young people has gained significant attention. One of the most influential voices in this debate is Jonathan Haidt. In his 2024 book, The Anxious Generation, Haidt observes that around 2012, when smartphones and social media became nearly universal among adolescents in many developed countries, rates of anxiety, depression, and self-harm began to rise, particularly among teenage girls. He does not claim that social media is the sole cause, but he argues that the shift from what he calls a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood has altered the developmental environment in ways that may increase psychological strain. Haidt identifies several mechanisms through which this may occur. First, sleep disruption, as late-night device use interferes with circadian rhythms and reduces restorative rest. Secondly, intensified social comparison, particularly on image-centric platforms where appearance, popularity, and validation are constantly quantified. Thirdly, cyberbullying and negative interactions amplified by permanence and reach of online communication. And fourth, algorithmic amplification, where systems designed to maximize engagement may increase exposure to emotionally charged or anxiety inducing content. Taken together, these mechanisms suggest not a single causal trigger, but a broader shift in the adolescent environment. Even if social media is not the sole driver of rising distress, it may function as an environmental amplifier during a developmentally sensitive stage of life. This framing has resonated with policymakers because it shifts the focus from individual weakness to systemic exposure. But the research community is far from unanimous. In 2019, Amy and Andrew analyzed large data sets to examine the relationship between digital technology use and adolescent well-being. They did find a negative association. Adolescents who reported heavier digital use tended, on average, to report slightly lower well-being, but the effect was modest. When the researchers asked how much difference screen time actually makes in a young person's life, the answer was relatively little on its own. Other factors, sleep quality, family relationships, and economic stress, accounted for a greater share of variation in well-being than digital use alone. In other words, social media may play a role but does not dominate the landscape of adolescent mental health. A similar caution appears in the work of Candice Odgers. She argues that the effects of digital technology are not uniform. Some adolescents, particularly those already vulnerable, may experience greater harm, but others may experience benefits. For some young people, online platforms provide connection, identity exploration, and community, especially for those who feel isolated offline. The emerging picture, therefore, is not uniform harm, it's uneven impact, risk for some, support for others. So where does this leave policymakers? The association between heavy social media use and psychological strain appears real, but its magnitude is debated, its mechanisms are still being studied, and its effects are unevenly distributed. Governments rarely regulate under conditions of scientific certainty. They act when risks appear plausible, even if those risks are not fully quantified. And when children are involved, the threshold of intervention is often lower. The evidence does not offer a simple verdict, but it defines the terrain on which the policy debate must unfold. If the evidence is contested, but the risk appears plausible, what can governments do? There are three broad approaches. Each rests on distinct political philosophy of what the state is allowed and required to do. In a free society, the state should not restrict liberty unless it has a clear and proportionate justification. If the evidence is uncertain, the burden of proof lies on the regulator. Under this view, parents and schools, not the state, are the primary institutions responsible for children's digital habits. This approach has few advantages. Firstly, it avoids state overreach. Secondly, it respects family diversity. Different households have different values and risk tolerances. Thirdly, it avoids building large-scale age verification systems that could expand into surveillance. Fourthly, this approach preserves access for children who benefit from online spaces, especially those who are isolated offline. But this policy course has its disadvantages. Non-intervention per se is not neutral. If platforms are engineered to maximize engagement, then children are not interacting with a neutral public square. They're interacting with an incentive-driven system. So the risk here is policy negligence. A government may be seen as allowing a plausible harm environment to continue without guardrails, and it assumes a level of parental capacity that is not evenly distributed across society. Liberty in practice can become unequal protection. Children are developmentally vulnerable, and the state has a duty of care. Most societies already accept age-based restrictions in domains where harm is foreseeable, alcohol, gambling, driving, and certain forms of labor. From this view, if credible risk exists, it is ethically permissible to restrict access until a threshold age. It's a precautionary response. And this approach has few advantages. Firstly, clarity. A rule is easier to communicate, enforce, and defend. Secondly, speed. If policymakers believe harm is urgent, this option acts quickly. Thirdly, it shifts responsibility onto platforms, the systems that profit from engagement, rather than leaving families to fight the battle alone. Fourthly, it sends a strong signal that child safety is a public priority. But every policy option comes with its own disadvantages. Now, restrictions can be blunt. They treat a heterogeneous group as uniform, yet the evidence suggests uneven impact. Risk for some, benefit for others. This option also depends on age verification. That can mean new data collection, new surveillance infrastructure, and new privacy risks. There's also a rights concern. Children are not merely subjects of protection, they are right bearers. A categorical ban may unintentionally harm those for whom online spaces are not entertainment but support. So the risk here is overreach, a protective policy that creates new harms while trying to prevent old ones. A third approach avoids both extremes. It accepts that protection may be necessary, but insists that restrictions must be targeted and proportionate. The governing idea is simple. If the goal is child safety, regulate the environment before excluding the user. This can include age-appropriate design codes, limits on algorithmic amplification for minors, restrictions on targeted advertising to children, default privacy protection, time use defaults, transparency and audit obligations, clear platform accountability standards. This approach has some advantages. This middle path approach has some advantages. Firstly, precision. It targets harmful design features rather than imposing a blanket exclusion. Secondly, proportionality. It attempts to reduce risk while preserving benefits. Thirdly, it avoids treating all minors as identically vulnerable. Fourthly, it focuses regulation on those who design and profit from the system, the platforms. When it comes to disadvantages, calibration is difficult. It requires regulatory capacity, technical expertise, and sustained oversight. It can be slower than a ban. It may produce uneven outcomes across platforms. And it can be politically less satisfying because it looks incremental rather than decisive. So the risk here is implementation failure, a good ethical design that collapses in execution. So these are the three routes: liberty first, precaution first, or calibration. Each has a philosophical basis, each has a moral cost, and that is a real governance challenge. Under uncertainty, every option carries risk. The task is not to eliminate risk, it is to justify publicly and carefully which risks a democracy is willing to accept and why. Children deserve protection. That is not in dispute. But protection is never exercised in a vacuum. Where democratic states restrict access, they exercise power. And power must justify itself, especially when evidence is contested and those affected cannot vote. The research does not offer a simple answer. It suggests risk, but not uniform harm. It suggests vulnerability, but not inevitability. So the debate is not between caring and not caring. It is between different judgments about risk. Some will argue that greater danger lies in exposure. Others will argue that greater danger lies in overreach. A mature democracy does not deny either risk. It weighs them carefully, publicly, and with an awareness that every choice, whether to act, to ban, or to calibrate, carries consequences. The question then is not whether to protect children. The question is how to do so without normalizing unnecessary restriction. That is the test. So long, Happy learning!